It's really crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty unreal. Like, I mean, even like these little trees that we would consider little trees
Are actually huge.
they're actually huge.
At least tall. Super tall.
And then yeah, people come from places where trees don't get any higher than like 30 feet.
People live in places where trees go into higher than like 15 feet. Even on the prairies, trees didn't grow naturally there.
And then we get those giant ones. Like you said, they're like 800 years old.
800,000
And
years
you
old.
stand there, you're like, what the what am I?
Spending 3 nights in the remote part of a difficult-to-access island with some of your best friends during the first warm spring days of the year is an intensely psychologically and spiritually healing experience. With the cold, dark winter coming to an end after a year of being locked up in our homes, Texada was the trip we needed to remember what it means to be human. After leaving the island, the group mostly disbanded. Ilya stayed in Powell River, Mackenzie returned to Vancouver, and Owen went back to Courtney. James and I, however, were headed to the northwestern coast of Vancouver Island. I've never been on the edge of the Pacific Ocean before. I've spent most of my life growing up in the suburbs of Vancouver, where the accessible ocean is mostly inlets protected by Vancouver Island. The area of water between Vancouver Island and the mainland is called the Strait of Georgia. Wind along the coast will sometimes funnel up or down the strait, but overall that section of water is quite calm as far as oceans go. I have also never spent any time on the island aside from an 8-hour field trip to Victoria when I was in grade 8. So already I knew this trip was going to be at least 2 firsts for me, but it ended up being a lot more. After leaving the ferry in Courtney, James and I headed north along Highway 19. Our goal was Cape Scott Provincial Park, the start of the North Coast Trail. Our plan was to hike into this remote park and spend a night at San Josef Bay. Driving north along the east coast of the island, once you pass Campbell River, civilization just sort of disappears, and it gets wet. In fact, the rainiest places in North America are dotted along the west and north coast of Vancouver Island. The rainiest place, Henderson Lake, receives 7.3 meters of rain on average per year. Many other regions along the west coast of BC top out at just over 3 meters. These places include Tassis and Port Alice, right in the region where we were headed, right in the middle of wet and rainy April. Driving through all this rain, we still had 2.5 hours to get to Port Hardy. Then, another hour plus of driving down a logging road and through the tiny town of Holberg, a fascinating community that has been a base camp for loggers for decades, which resides at the tip of a very, very long inlet that almost splits the island in two, then doubles back on itself. On our way into Holberg, we passed a sign that said Goodspeed Fossil Bed, which we decided to check out on our way back. As we got closer to the trailhead, the weather kept changing. One moment it was sunny, the next it was pissing rain, then it cleared, and it even started snowing for a very brief period. We were very concerned about what the weather would be doing as we hiked into the campsite. But the concern was dwarfed by our excitement. No amount of rain would be able to dampen the pure novelty that awaited us. Luck was on our side when we finally arrived at the trailhead. The clouds parted and the sun shone through. We donned our packs and headed out. The first few steps onto the trail marked the first few steps towards me finally standing on the edge of the Pacific Ocean. And I was ready. As we walked, I noticed 2 things. 1, I'd never seen so much moss in my life. This was a true rainforest where the humidity rarely drops below 80%. And 2, the rainforest here was very different from the rainforests of Vancouver. This was true old-growth forest.
Whoa! Oh, dude! Oh.
Holy shit.
That's a big
You wanna go stand beside it? Holy shit, that thing's huge.
We were walking among giants, elders of the past, beings that were alive and established even before the first European settlers landed in North America. Mighty gods that do not move or speak, yet reached out and touched a part of my psyche that had long since been dormant. A reminder that I am but a cog in a machine, a blink of an eye, a speck of dust floating through a sunbeam. And I felt alive. The speck of dust in the sunbeam is the one you can see. In the presence of ancients, time loses meaning, and you become one with the stable chaos of nature. As we progressed through the behemoths, admiring the strange shapes and structures that form over hundreds of years, we began to hear the roar of the surf. At first, I thought it was the wind, not expecting breaking of waves to be a constant drone. But it grew louder as we drew closer to the beach. Finally, we broke through the trees. The tide was out, and in front of us was a massive, empty beach leading into the mighty Pacific, sparkling in the setting sun. Even though we were in a bay, we could see the ocean stretch out into the horizon. With the old growth to my back, the vast ocean in front of me, a sandy beach stretching for miles to the north, and no other humans in sight, the tiny bit of ego I had left dissolved into joy and exhilaration. Once again, I was a speck of dust floating through this land, and I felt welcome. The sun shone down on us, as if to say, "I'm glad you can make it. Welcome to paradise." We picked out a campsite, and James ran off to embrace the land as I set up my tent. I myself took many breaks to marvel at where we were. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about how yet again my expectations were so grounded in what I knew, there was no way I could have been prepared for that place. Another landmark moment in a trip full of jaw-dropping scenery. And yet somehow, unbeknownst to me, it was going to keep getting better. When I awoke the next morning, James was already up and wandering down the beach. The water was still a fair distance from the trees, but was just beginning to retreat from high tide. The gentle waves took turns running up the sand, only to retreat to the safety of the ocean. A black powder of what I could only assume was organic material from the water runoff of the forest was caught up in the surf, churning hypnotic patterns in the waves like an unbounded sand ornament. When the streams that brought this material down to the ocean ran dry, they would leave beautiful braided beds in the sand. Looking back towards the forest, I saw large clouds rising out of the sand as the sun evaporated the water from the rainfall the previous night. Again, this was a true rainforest, and even though the rain had long since stopped, the cycle of evaporation and condensation on the high, dense canopy continued the localized rain for hours to come. We loaded up our bags and set out to explore the beach and the adjacent forest. First order of business was to collect water. Up until now, all of my backpacking experience had been in the mountains, mostly in alpine and subalpine areas where the water is running crystal clear from glaciers. But collecting water on the coast is different. Instead of collecting water from a stream, since the only river was brackish due to the tide going in and out of it, we had to collect groundwater that was dripping out of the forest floor over some rocks. This water has potentially been in the forest floor for a very long time, and comes out looking like tea due to all the tannins. Because of this, it is incredibly soft and some of the most delicious water we had ever tasted. Moving down the beach, we came to the famous rock formations of San Josef Bay, which, honestly, I had forgotten about. With nobody else around, we felt like we were on another planet. These 20-foot spires rose out of the sand like gods watching over a gateway to another world. James and I dubbed them the gatekeepers, When the tide is out, this spot acts as a quick and easy passage to the second beach. If the tide is in, you must take a very muddy, rather difficult trail up and over the cliff to the next beach that takes about 15 minutes to hike. Due to the placement of the rocks, they are largely protected from the sun, and in addition get partially submerged in the cold Pacific water twice a day. This leads to a refrigeration effect where the rocks are always cold and suck the heat out of the surrounding air. One can feel the temperature drop many degrees when stepping in among these gatekeepers. When I approached the rocks, it got dark and cold, and I began to get introspective, and my optimism began to fade. Within minutes, I would begin to shiver and I would have to step back out into the sunlight, the open air, the sound of wind and water. The vast beach and warm sun brought me back into the present and relaxed me. It was a powerful juxtaposition, and didn't take much to imagine an ancient civilization worshipping these monoliths. So I stepped back among them, and when I got cold, I stepped back into the sun to thaw myself out. I repeated this pattern many times. It was an intense contrast of two different perceptions of the world that really got me thinking about how one's environment shapes the way they interact with the world around them. Since the tide was in, we decided to hike over what we dubbed the Treacherous Trail, which involved climbing 15 meters up a cliff using a rope, navigating deep puddles of mud, and admiring the wind-stripped trees and more old-growth forest.
Dude, where are we going?
We're on the beach.
Oh, it's pretty intense.
That's what's going on.
To help pass the time, James taught me some Indian geography.
The place in India that claims to be the wettest place on earth because they get a ton of rain. They get like 10 meters. Way more than we get. It's more like in downpours. But it's kind of in the mountains. It's actually it's basically Bangladesh. It's like Bangladesh just on the border of Bangladesh. Like 10 kilometers north.
Yeah.
They make these bridges there out of roots actually. Like
Oh, that's cool.
They use roots of trees and make these huge bridges. Like
Oh, they just
20 feet
like direct them?
yeah, they like direct and trees around the roots and over like a generation to create like a whole grove of tree roots. But anyway, this is the area where it rains like the time. Just north of Bangladesh, like basically the delta there. I think that might even be the biggest, the second biggest. That's the Amazon. Just all that water from all the rivers and the ocean, the sea, and the monsoons.
That's crazy.
Pounding these trees down, suddenly rise right out of the delta.
Finally, after almost 30 minutes of basically swimming through mud, the trail opened up into a bit of a riverbed, which in turn opened up into yet another expansive beach. This beach was dotted with rope swings, more amazing rock formations, and another campsite. In one section, there was a beautiful sheet of water running in laminar flow over the sand. Once again, we felt like we could have been on another planet. As the tide went out, it exposed the passage that allowed us to go back to the guardians of the first beach, as well as some large caves that we were unable to access before. At this point, my GoPro had died, and I was mostly using my DSLR to take photos. After exploring the caves and beaches, we packed up and headed back to the car. We drove to a nearby forestry site and camped amongst some more giant trees. This tree was almost as big as my 2001 Pathfinder. Listening to the audio, you can really hear the perpetual rain of the rainforest. That night, a man joined us at the campground named Cope, a retired army vet from Ontario looking to find a new direction in life on the west coast. He told us about a small cove he found that was well hidden nearby that we decided to check out the next day. If we hadn't been told about the cove, we never would have found it. It was several turns down a complicated logging road. Followed by a few minutes down something that more closely resembled a mud pit than a trail. But we eventually broke through the trees onto the beach. This was the high-intensity Pacific coast I was looking for. The huge waves sounded like a train as they rushed up the beach and crashed into the rocks. The wind ripped at our coats, and even though the sun was out when we arrived, it wasn't long before the sideways rain began. Once again, I was consumed by the chaos of nature. We found a trail that led us through some more trees and over a small ridge. Again, we had to climb a rope to get down to the other side. At this point, the waves had become significantly bigger. To our left and right, large, jagged rocks stuck out of the ocean, spraying seawater as 4 to 8 foot waves crashed against them. I was so captivated by my surroundings, I forgot to capture more footage. After spending a couple hours walking around the rocks and popping in and out of the woods, we decided it was time to begin our trek back to Port Hardy and check out Goodspeed Fossil Bed. The drive back took a strange turn as the temperature began to plummet. The access road up to the fossil bed was a steep, high-clearance-only hill. As we drove up, one of the most powerful hailstorms I've ever experienced began. The funniest part was that at this point, our experience had been so numerous and so intense. The only footage I have of the fossil bed is this image of the sign. We basically got there, looked around, and said, "Neat." But here are some pictures of the fossils in the bed. My dad and I dated them to roughly 220 million years ago. Heading east across the island, the temperature continued to drop. When it started snowing, James and I decided that camping our last night there wasn't the best call. So we spent the night at a hotel in Port Hardy. Once at the hotel, we felt we had made the right choice. A hot shower, James had a chance to dry his tent, and a comfortable bed to sleep in. That night, it snowed a lot, and we sat in our cozy 4th-room floor, had some gourmet food, found a relic of the past, and watched the fishermen pull into the harbor and unload their boat in the snow. James found a brochure of a map and got super excited about reviewing where we went. I slept very well that night. I've decided to turn this into a 3-part series, as everything we experienced was too much to fit into just 2 videos. Tune into the next video for our final day on Vancouver Island, where we explore some mountain roads and go spelunking.